Hello everyone and welcome to the second episode of Just Political Reality. I hope you enjoyed the first and I hope this one equally, if not more, satisfies your requirements. On this week's show we'll be looking at standards in public life. As MPs appear to plumb yet further depths, is there any hope for an improvement in this area? And if so, what needs to happen to make it so? There'll also be an update on the local elections with councils in England, Scotland and Wales, nearly 200 in total, all having seats available for election. Finally, there's an interview with Stuart Smith. Stuart is British but has a Russian wife and has spent a lot of time in Russia, the Baltics and indeed China and even North Korea. And Stuart has a slightly different view to the mainstream media one in relation to the genesis of the Russian invasion, which, funnily enough, did not start in 2022 or even 2014. So Stuart will be putting the case for perhaps looking at things through slightly less foggy spectacles than the mainstream media do at the moment. Let's get on with it. When you're as old as I am, I turned 51 this week, it comes with certain advantages. Despite the grey hair, in fact the hair in places you really would rather you didn't have hair, you learn from experience. John Major, back to basics. Remember that? The Tories' sleaze and expenses and various other scandals of the 1990s have come back to haunt them again. And in fairness, it's not just the Tories. There are 56 members of Parliament under investigation for sexually inappropriate behaviour. Out of a cohort of 650, when I went to school, that's more than 8% of the total. Not great, is it? Not great at all. So we actually had a resignation this week for inappropriate behaviour. Neil Parish, resigning after watching porn once, apparently unintentionally, whilst looking for tractors, and once intentionally, whilst presumably not. Partygate. Once is never, twice is always. Let's see what happens with further fixed penalty notices, but I think, to be honest with you, most people are fed up of the discussion, and that includes me. Durham Partygate, on the other hand, and whether or not Angela Rayner was there, she was, does rather smack of rank hypocrisy, especially for a leader and deputy leader of the Labour Party who have consistently called on Boris Johnson to resign for deliberately misleading the House of Commons. Well, it took 5 months for Sir Keir Starmer's office to establish that Angela Rayner was in fact in Durham at the event in question. Keir with a beer, you've seen it. Yes, Angela was there, pizza and all. And, well, in my opinion, I don't really see the difference between a bit of birthday cake in Downing Street, yawn, and beer and pizza in Durham. Not least as you've got to travel a long way to get to Durham, whereas Downing Street is the home of the Prime Minister. But hey, hypocrisy, the Labour Party, they're good bedfellows. Now in my view, it is time for a bonfire of the vanities. I am sick and tired of standards in public life continuing to bump along the bottom. In fact, worse than that, plumbing new depths with every passing week, it would seem. Noses in the trough, sexual peccadillos, expenses scandals, general sleaze, even poor standards of dress. The whole thing needs a kick up the backside. Whether it's 50, 15 or 115 MPs that need to leave Parliament, so be it. I don't care. If they're no good, and if they're up to no good, they shouldn't be there. In my opinion, mobile phones should not be used in the chamber. If they really have to have them, because they're so important, let them have dumb phones. They can use SMSs and they can't watch porn. I don't like the use of the word liar. Ian Blackford used it repeatedly and was allowed to do so by Lindsay Hoyle in the debate on the referral of Boris Johnson to the Standards Committee, and he was allowed to get away with it, having previously been suspended from the Commons by Hoyle for using and refusing to retract it against Johnson previously. Now, Hoyle himself should wear his wig. Call me a traditionalist. I am a traditionalist. I'll wear that with a badge of honour. And also Hoyle's involvement in Rainagate and the Mail on Sunday affair. Quite right, the Mail on Sunday editor turning around and saying, I'm not coming to the House of Commons. I don't answer to you. Now this is a cross-party issue. For every Claudia Webb acid thrower extraordinaire wannabe, there is an Imran Ahmad Khan interfering with 15-year-old boys. These people have the power to lock us down, and they did, repeatedly. They have the power to take us to war. The least they can do is behave appropriately, dress properly, stop turning Parliament into a free-for-all for deviants and criminals. And if they can't do that, they must go. It is that simple. You may recall last week we looked at things that may drive voter intentions in the forthcoming local elections on Thursday. In England alone, over 4,300 seats are being contested across 140 councils, whilst in Scotland and Wales, 32 councils, that's all of them in Scotland, and 22, that's also all of them in Wales, are being contested. In terms of areas where the Tories look particularly vulnerable, they don't have that many authorities left in London that they have control of, but Wandsworth and Westminster both look to be extremely vulnerable. In Wandsworth in particular, all of the local MPs are now Labour, so it's reasonable to assume that if voter intentions follow what happened in 2019, and there's no reason to assume that the Tories' position will improve in the intervening period, that that authority is likely to go. For those that have been around long enough to remember, this was a flagship Thatcherite local authority back in the 1980s, to the point where they actually had zero council tax for several years. Quite the demise. It's never been anything other than Conservative, so hold on to your hats. The other areas where the Tories do look to be vulnerable are in Barnet and Harlow, and outside of the metropolis, Southampton and Thurrock. In Croydon, Labour have bankrupted the local council. I kid you not. That actually represents a reasonable opportunity for the Conservatives to, at the very least, deny Labour a majority. And I am damning deliberately with faint praise. They should at the very least end up as the largest party. In Scotland, the question really is who's going to be the first reserve behind the SNP. It would appear that Labour are resurgent, relatively, under Anna Sarwar, and that Tories may well be relegated back to third place. In Wales, the Tories are defending a strong showing from 2018 in the northeast of the country, where Labour actually need to hold on to Cardiff, where they appear to be under some pressure. In terms of electoral expectations, anything under 350 net losses for the Tories, they would probably consider a success. I think it's going to be nearer 750. With this number of seats available, I can't see them holding what they've got, and certainly I can't see them making gains either. They may make the odd gain here and there, but overall they're going to lose seats. As for Labour, will they recover in the Red Wall, or will they at least begin to do so? Hartlepool, that's a flagship for them. Will they take that back from the Tories? Let's see. My prediction is that Labour will make some gains, probably 200 to 300, and they probably will finish second in Scotland. I think the biggest concern I have about the local elections is voter turnout. I expect it to be ruinously low. What does that look like? 20-odd%, perhaps even in the teens in certain areas. I think there is so much disaffection with politics that we could well see a record low voter turnout in certain areas. The high watermark for local elections tends to be when they're held in conjunction with a general election, but when they're not, it's not uncommon for voter turnout to be in the mid-30s%. I expect the average to be appreciably below that this time round. Hello everyone, on the next part of today's show, I'll be speaking with Stuart Smith. Stuart now lives in Manchester, but first went to Russia in 1998 and spent many years there, and met and married his wife Olga 15 years ago. Stuart's also lived in Estonia, and in his time overseas has also spent extensive time in Russia, the Baltics, Poland, and has even travelled to China and North Korea. He is well acquainted with the region. In the mid-2000s, Stuart dabbled in the Russian Western dating industry and even wrote a book on dating in Russia in 2008, available from all good outlets online. Stuart has a keen geopolitical interest that led to him being published by sites including RT and Russia Insider. Stuart is the owner of a themed discussion forum where people discuss everything from dating in the region right through to cultural stuff and indeed politics. Welcome, Stuart. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks for having me on, Chris. Nice to see you.
Stuart, I'm mindful that the Russian invasion of Ukraine always seems to be presented through the prism of Ukraine good, Russia/Putin bad. And I find that rather an oversimplification of things. Would you be kind enough to give me your views on what the background was to the invasion and what the triggers were for this, which to my mind goes back further than the deposition, the removal of Viktor Yanukovych in 2014, which seems to be the only part of history that people go back to. Can I just have your views and your thoughts as to why this has happened and how we've got to where we are today?
Well, you're quite correct. I agree that we only seem to get one side of the story here, and the narrative that everybody's expected to follow is Ukraine bad and Russia, Ukraine good and Russia bad. And if you're not draped in the Ukrainian flag all over your social media avatars, you're labelled as a Putin sympathiser. There doesn't seem to be really two points of the discussion.
Not at all.
Indeed, I mean, most people are not even discussing what happened in 2014. The narrative that we're usually reading in the media is something like USSR collapsed in 1991. Nothing at all happened, and then nasty Mr. Putin rolled in with his tanks in 2022, and it's absolutely unprovoked. And Zelensky's a hero, which is all we get to hear about.
Well, he's all over the media, so and he seems to have a great joy in front of that camera, so it must be true.
He's got a fantastic PR company, that's for sure. I'm sure it's based out of Washington. But I mean, if we just go back,
tongue in cheek, right there, is it?
Absolutely. If we just started at the 2014, when the Russian-leaning Yanukovych was in power in Ukraine, there was a lot of, I mean, Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe anyway, and there was a lot of corruption under his rule. And my understanding is that he'd already signed an agreement to go, and factions within the country there pretty much forced him out. And I think most people who take an interest in this stuff are pretty agreed that the Americans were behind that, and it was a coup. And that's what caused really Russia to move at that time and secure Crimea. Because the end result would have been, after they installed Poroshenko in Kiev, then they would have eventually moved to Crimea, and then they would have tried to cancel Russia's lease on Sevastopol.
Yes.
And that was absolutely a red line for Russia.
Do you want to just explain the strategic importance of Sevastopol?
Well, Sevastopol, I mean, it's right there on the Black Sea in Crimea, and it's what Putin calls it, the site of Russia's naval glory. Yeah. And it's a place that's very much in the heart of Russian people. Even people that's never been, they'll talk wistfully to you all evening at the dacha about Sevastopol and Crimea. But actually, what a lot of people don't realise about Crimea, similar to Lugansk and Donetsk, is that they did try and have a referendum several times previous to 2014, and in fact they had one, and Kiev completely ignored it. They just wanted autonomy, in the same way that Wales and Scotland here have got relative autonomy.
So this is very similar to,
didn't get it.
Sorry, this is very similar to the Catalan situation, where the Catalans want to leave Spain. They had a so-called illegal referendum that says we want to leave Spain, but Madrid wouldn't listen. So you're actually saying that in the case of Crimea, they view themselves as Russian largely, and they would rather be part of Russia than part of Ukraine. Have I got that right?
Absolutely. Crimea always wanted to be part of Russia, and governments are very good at ignoring referendums and group opinion when it doesn't agree with the narrative. Look at Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland. She wants to run that referendum again and again and again until she gets the result she wants.
Well, it's best of 3, best of 5, best of 7, best of 77, if that's what it
Absolutely,
takes.
Yeah. And that's much the same with the people in Donetsk and Lugansk. They declared independence. They said, we don't want any part of this.
Yeah.
American-controlled, as it is de facto American-controlled Ukraine under Poroshenko, as it was. And they declared their independence. And what our media isn't talking about is Ukraine, backed by the West, has then been shelling them for the last 8 years.
Well, with 14,000 lives lost as well. I mean,
13,000, 14,000 people dead, indeed.
And we won't even go into Hunter Biden's laptop because get kicked off YouTube if we do.
As we know, Hunter Biden is very well qualified to work for Ukrainian electricity companies.
Well, on $80,000 a month, apparently.
Yeah.
But as I say, I'm likely to have
John Kerry. I think he was there as well.
Well, and they're not the only ones, are they?
There's 4 of them at the top of American government that's had children working for utility companies in Ukraine. Incredible.
And the national wage in Ukraine is, was it $200 a month or it's equivalent?
About $200-300 a month.
Yeah, and these guys were shipping $80,000 a month, or certainly Hunter was, on behalf of the big guy. But we can't talk about that. So let's park that one because I'd actually like this interview to stay up for more than 3 or 4 minutes without being accused of anti-democrat disinformation. How much do you think the expansionism of both the European Union and NATO has impacted Putin? I mean, I'll make the comparison for those that are long enough in the tooth, they'll know it. The Bay of Pigs situation, where Cuba was going to host Soviet nuclear weapons that were pointed at America, the Americans didn't quite fancy having nuclear weapons on somebody else's lawn right next to theirs, and yet the encroachment right up to the border with Russia of both the European Union and NATO, they don't think that threatens Russia in any way whatsoever. I imagine that the Russian view, not just the Putin view, but the Russian wider view would be rather different. Would I be right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a huge geographical boundary, isn't there, between NATO countries, the EU, yep, and Russia. And since the Baltic countries joined in 2004, the Baltic countries joined the EU, and Estonia, under its American President Isles, as he was, they forged, they decided they were scared of Russia. Nobody in Estonia at that time was scared of Russia, but Estonia made a career of saying how scared of Russia they was and how they were going to come over the border into Narva and take over the country. I've been to Narva. If you went to Narva, you'd realise nobody wants it. But, but of course, Russia doesn't want this huge proliferation of weapons all the way down its border, which are apparently friendly and not offensive in the slightest.
Look at it. Is it over 1,000-mile stretch? Am I right in saying that?
I think it's probably more than that. Yeah.
I mean, it's to me. I mean, look, we're an island nation, so arguably we're not in that situation. But if somebody said they were going to go and put nuclear weapons in the Republic of Ireland that were pointed at London or Manchester or Birmingham, we wouldn't tolerate that. Why should we? Now, absolutely. I mean, in saying these very words, I'm absolutely sure that certain, shall we say, free speech absolutists will use their free speech absolutism to call me a Putin sympathizer, a Ukraine denier. I'm no such thing. Let me be clear. I abhor what Putin has done. Have there been war crimes in Bucha and various other places? There certainly appear to have been. But I'm also very aware that propaganda works both ways. And in particular, with Volodymyr Zelensky, he is, as you've said yourself, extremely competent at, shall we say, media management.
The thing about Zelensky that also our media doesn't discuss, he was voted in 2019 on a ticket to stop corruption and stop what was going on the border of Donetsk, and he was brought in to implement the Minsk agreements to give those places autonomy.
Yep.
And he's done nothing except shell them.
Well, he's also, I think, imprisoned one of the opposition leaders, maybe more than one now, and I think has he not banned all the opposition political parties?
He's banned opposition political parties. He jailed that guy Victor, I forget his second name. There's a guy that probably would be president if there was another election.
Yeah, it was back in December, I think. So this sort of thing, this is, I mean, let's not pretend that Ukraine is a Western style democracy. It wasn't, and it isn't. and clearly not now. And you can applaud the brave Ukrainian people for standing up to the Russian bear, armed with an awful lot of support. I mean, when people criticise Britain over the visa scheme, and it's the Home Office, so they're useless. But in terms of the on-the-ground support that we have given to Ukraine, in terms of the training we've given, in terms of the weaponry that we've given, I don't think anybody could argue that Britain has more than stood up and delivered, to the point where, have we put ourselves in the gun sights? If Putin decides that it's the nuclear option, we get it first.
I don't believe that there will be a nuclear option. I think that's just saber rattling, really.
I agree with you. My concern, though, is if you push someone further and further and further into a corner, because I'll be candid, I don't think the peace talks are meaningful. I don't think there's any real ongoing peace process. That to me just seems like a sham, and I suspect that's on both sides. But certainly there doesn't seem to be any meaningful dialogue there going on. But what's your view on Putin and his mindset? How do you think? How is it? In fact, let's take it beyond Putin. Bearing in mind, Putin is very good at connecting with the psyche of the average Russian, and he's a very proud Russian. Peter the Great's his big inspiration, everything else. With all of that knowledge that you've got, how do you think that he and most Russians see what is going on now and what will happen and what should happen next?
I think a lot of people in Russia realise more than people in the West do that really what we're seeing here, the people of Ukraine are really pawns in this, the victims of it, the average, but the people that's affected and the people that's displaced by the military operation. And what we're seeing, if we take a larger view, we're seeing a proxy war between the US and Russia. And Ukraine is really just the chessboard today. It moved from Syria. At the moment, it's Ukraine.
Okay.
And they're going to push it. They'll push and push and push Russia from every angle. They filled Estonia full of missiles. They filled Lithuania, Latvia full of missiles. They filled Poland full of missiles. And Putin always said to them, "Do you know what? You're not going to be doing that in Ukraine." And they pushed and pushed and pushed. And
he's had enough. And how much do you think influence of the Chinese got over Putin? I mean, clearly in terms of buying gas and everything else, which they need for their economy. But how much soft power do you think the Chinese actually hold over Putin? Because you're quite clear you don't think the nuclear option is actually an option. You think it's a red herring.
I think it's the last resort, and I think we'd have to go a lot further for it to be a viable option.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is people see someone like Lavrov, who looks like a proper old school attack dog, and they hear him make these kind of pronouncements, and you think, crikey, yeah, maybe. I've got to say, I mean, I live in London. If they are pointing here, well, when it comes, I'm not going to feel it. It'll happen very quickly.
You'll get it first. We're okay in the north.
Right. I know where I'm holidaying this year then. Talk to me about some of the impacts of the war. I mean, the ruble initially tanked, but is now up above the level it was pre-war. This thing where Putin has turned the taps off for Poland and Bulgaria because they refuse to pay him in rubles. And look, it's clever. It's clever insofar as it devalues the euro or whatever the other currency is, and it increases the value of the ruble. To me, it makes a lot of sense. I get it. I get why he's doing it. But do you think there's going to be further and wider with this? Or do you think, for example, the Germans will do what's purported to be happening, go to Switzerland, set up an account with Gazprom, and they'll keep paying in rubles and they'll keep getting their gas?
The thing is, I mean, we haven't yet really been hit properly by counter sanctions. And before any of this happened in Ukraine, it's foolish to not imagine that Putin and his top guys have sat down and they said, right, we're going to go in, we're going to do this. What's the worst that can happen? And they're not stupid. They've all sat around and said, right, America's going to do this, this, and this. They're going to turn off the visa. They're going to turn off the SWIFT. They're going to do all the stuff that they've been threatening to do for ages. So they've gamed all that out. They had sanctions in 2014. They've learned how to get around them. They've learned how to substitute from internal supply. They've learned how to diversify the trade with India and China and different places. And I think China does have a degree of soft power for sure. Putin has been building his relationship with China for some time. And it's only a few years ago that President Xi was at his side during the victory parade in Moscow. and you can see really that they are forging that relationship, and it's been going on for some time.
You see, the way I see China, and I might be, I mean, you are much closer to this than I am, but as an outsider looking in, the way I see the way she is operating, it appears to me that my enemy's enemy is my friend. So if today Putin is flavour of the month and he's providing the Chinese with gas and whatever else they need, then that's fine. But I think there's probably a limit to how far China would allow Putin to go, given that their ambitions are 500, 1,000 years. They think super long term. They're not thinking about their lifetime and their grandkids.
Yeah, they take the long view for sure.
Yeah, they take a super long view. So they don't want Putin to start doing anything that sort of, you know, is going to damage. They want to be, you know, the next imperial nation. They want to take over what they want to take, and leave the rest to others. But ultimately, the China-Russia relationship, would you call it a relationship of convenience, or do you think it's a bit deeper than that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's certainly convenience. It probably goes a bit deeper because they've got common interests.
Yes, they have.
And they've got common interest in de-dollarizing, for sure. They've both been doing that for some considerable time.
Well,
she wants the RMB to be a reserve currency. Russia would love to see the ruble as a reserve currency.
Yeah.
And everybody, really, the only way to decline the influence of the US around the world warmongering, if we stop using dollars, you export them back to the States, you create inflation there, and they can't fund the war machine so easily.
Well, I think the Chinese are the second, if not the I think the Japanese are the biggest. I think the Chinese are the second biggest owners of US counterparty debt on, you know, on stuff where they've issued, you know, quantitative easing type documents, gilts and that sort of thing. So they've already got a load of IOUs there. And then, I mean, there's no question to me that the US dollar has always been, you know, as you say, the safe haven, the go-to currency in tough times. But I think that's finished. I mean, American inflation now is what, 8.75, 8.5% and rising. I think the States is in a terrible mess. The national debt is $30 trillion and it's expected to rise even, and this is what Biden has budgeted for, by around $1.2 trillion a year throughout the 2020s. So, you know, it's only going one way. It's to me, it's an economy that is destined at some stage to go bust. Now, I don't mean that means that's the end of the United States, but, you know, they are heading for severe economic depression. And to my mind, and I've thought this for some time, in terms of capital flows, if you want to know where the future is, look east. Would you share that sentiment?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think the view between both Russia and China, and this is something that they share, they'd like to relegate the US to be a regional power.
Yes.
And Putin, if you read some of his speeches, and you know, the best thing, something I always say to people actually, if you want to know what Putin thinks, don't look at the media. Go to Kremlin.ru, read his speeches, read the translations. Don't read an interpretation of what somebody said he said. Go and read what he actually said, and you'll often find it's slightly different.
Yeah, Kremlin.ru. There you go.
Yeah.
For those that believe in facts rather than, shall we say, created for reality. Talk to me.
What I was going to add to that was that Putin's always spoke of a multipolar world, and he thinks world peace is easier achieved when you've got several centres of power around the world rather than one throwing its weight around as we get with the US.
He may have a point. Do you think there's a lot of domestic support for, well, certainly the initial invasion, but now, I mean, this war is 2 months and, you know, a few days in. Do you think that the support within Russia for Putin's objectives remains as resolute as it did at the point of invasion?
I think it's reduced a little bit for sure. But you've possibly read some of the research of the Levada Institute, they're a polling company.
Yeah.
His approval rating, and even the West trust Levada for some reason, seems to be quite accurate. But his approval ratings, his approval ratings in Russia, Western politicians could only dream of.
Yeah.
And it does look as if he's gone slightly beyond the original objectives of securing the people who declared independence in Donetsk and Lugansk. But I think that was partly because of the sanctions, because America threw the kitchen sink at him, and so did we and all the EU. And he said, well, do you know what? Since we're in this situation, let's just do what we wanted to do in 2014, recreate the Novorossiya border.
Would you say rumours of Putin's demise are exaggerated? I mean, we hear an awful lot about his health and in gripping tables and looking slightly puffy, and his state of mind perhaps being a little erratic. Is this all propaganda, George, or do you think there's actually some merit to this?
Well, the Mail carried a story today about Putin's health, saying he's having cancer surgery and he's got Parkinson's and all kinds of stuff. And when you read when you actually read the source of this, it's somebody's Telegram account, and that isn't what I call like a particularly strong journalistic source.
That's rigor for you then. Intellectual rigor. Yeah. Strikes again. Okay.
But if you look at really what our media does as well, it wasn't very long ago they were telling you that Kim Jong-un was dead, that he'd had a heart attack and this kind of thing, and he was nothing of the sort. It turns out he may have had a stent or something and a month off at his holiday home.
Yes, it's almost like the school playground, isn't it? Except on the geopolitical stage, on things that actually really matter. How serious do you think Putin is about going to war with NATO? Is that a bit like the nuclear thing, where when it all comes down to it, the sabres are being rattled, but really, in his heart of hearts, he's got his strategic objectives. He's got Victory Day coming up on the 9th of May, and clearly that's a big day for him, and he wants to have something to stand beside for that. But do you think he's serious about taking on NATO? Not
at all. I think it's the last thing that they would want to do.
Brilliant.
And I think that kind of works both ways as well.
You've just encapsulated in a very short sentence pretty much what's been going through my head since before this invasion and the troop build-up began, which is that when it all comes down to it, the Russian-speaking areas in Donetsk, Luhansk, and obviously the Crimea, and there's no question about this, Russian speakers have been persecuted. Fact. Yeah. I don't think anybody in the international community could decry that another way. There may well be people in those regions that would still regard themselves as Ukrainian rather than Russian, perhaps.
Yeah.
But when it all comes down, once again, it's so easy to take that line of least resistance. I mean, relying on a Telegram account, my word, what are we doing? Right, okay. You've answered me categorically. You don't think Putin will launch a nuclear weapon, which is great. I can go and let Mrs. Davies know that she can prepare the Sunday dinner, and we're definitely okay. One thing that Putin has consistently said, and I just want to wrap up with your thoughts on this, is that there is a red line that he does not want NATO to cross. He's accepted, quote unquote, that munitions are being provided to the Ukrainians for defense. He won't accept aircraft overflying Ukrainian airspace. If the UK, the US, NATO members provided the means for that to happen, is that a red line for him?
I think the real red line will be if NATO forces crossed the border and went into fight. I think that will be the absolute red line.
I'm going to ask you your view. Mine is there is absolutely no chance that any NATO forces will do that unless he's a first strike. NATO is not designed for it. NATO is a defensive, or theoretically anyway, NATO is a defensive organisation.
I don't think the people in Iraq and Libya would agree with that. But.
Well, yeah, that's why I said theoretically. We can all be weasel words, can't we? But to my mind, I think if NATO does provide air support for Ukraine and gives the Ukrainians the means to be able to attack the Russians from the sky, I would think that then is a major escalation for Putin. But can you see that happening?
Russia's really some time ago already declared it's got control of the skies.
Yeah,
I think that as soon as it crosses the border, it'll be gone. And they've been attacking the means. I mean, the past few days they've been attacking railway lines.
Yeah,
which has been used to bring.
Which is the weapons coming into the country.
Yeah, keep it all in the west out of the way.
Yeah,
and they've took out some munition stores in Lviv.
Yeah,
where a lot of them were. And so I think their objective at the moment is just to keep they're not going to be able to keep all the weapons from flowing over the border from Poland, but they are going to be able to stop them getting to the east. And the other thing that people, there is this narrative in our media as well that like Putin is losing, and there is this belief that he wanted to go in there and occupy the whole country, which isn't the case.
No.
And he didn't want to go in and even occupy Kiev. He wanted to secure really the east. And that is pretty much done.
And just to prove he could, presumably, on the same day that Antonio Gutierrez was in Kiev, he made sure that a couple of missiles landed in Kiev, just so he can show that he can still reach it.
Now, you know, Kiev is apparently under attack from Russia every 5 minutes, but it doesn't stop all these people, doesn't stop Blinken from the States and Boris and everybody going in and out. No. So it's clearly secure enough that world leaders can go in there, stroll around, have a cup of coffee.
How comfortable are you with the images of Boris and Zelensky and, you know, the glad hand in the slaps on the back and aren't we all good chums together? How does that make you feel? Do you think that was just a little bit of propaganda, electioneering maybe from Boris at a time when, you know, the polls were not looking too good for him, not looking too good for him again today for entirely different reasons? How did that make you feel when you saw that?
Well, a cynic would suggest that Boris thinks this is a golden opportunity to push Partygate off the front pages, and it has done.
You could say that, sir. I couldn't possibly comment.
Indeed.
I think the official line from the front.
From Mr. Urquhart.
Wonderful stuff. Just a few closing thoughts then. So the situation in Moldova around sort of Transnistria, where there's been some false flag type activity. I mean, as I understand it, the issue there is that, again, there are Russian-speaking people that have been persecuted, and they are wanting to wave their Russian flags and say, look, leave us alone. We view ourselves as Russian. Have I got that right? Have I disseminated the nonsense, the wheat from the chaff correctly? Or have I just been propagandized by the Kremlin?
No, it's much the same. There's that little strip of Transnistria at the top of Moldova where it joins Ukraine.
Yep.
And they've been de facto independent for some years.
Indeed.
And it's all been pretty quiet there. But yeah, now there's been forces in there doing things, and there's been bits of bombs going off, and they're blaming the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are blaming the Russians, and until they catch a few people, they don't know. There's been a few Russian peacekeepers in there, but they're not real Russian army. From what I understand, it's local folks in the army who have Russian passports.
Yeah. Final question, really. Well, actually, two final questions. Is there a problem with fascism in Ukraine?
The difference between Ukraine and Russia, when Putin got power in Russia, he managed to separate the oligarchy from politics quite well.
Yeah.
He let them pretty much go away and do their own thing.
Yeah.
Subject to certain conditions, and that really didn't happen in Ukraine. So you've got the oligarchy is intertwined with the government in Ukraine, so they have a lot of influence, some of these guys. And a lot of the people that's fighting in the east, there's also a differential between the Ukrainian army and this people's militia, which there's kind of two distinct groups there.
Very much so.
And you've got the Azov guys and the right, the other Pravda sector and these C-14 and all these other Nazi groups. Of course, you can't say, they're all Nazis in Ukraine. You can't.
Yeah.
But those groups, small as they claimed to be, they do have a significant influence.
Okay. Final question. Do you see the war expanding outside of Ukraine into other territories?
Personally, I think it's almost finished. I think the east is pretty much secured. It's a question of defining where the boundary is going to be, and that may take a little bit of scuffling. Mariupol is pretty much done. There's just that steel plant where it looks like they're starving them out of there rather than bombing them out. And
they've started actually today, Sunday, and folks announced there's a humanitarian corridor being set up, and that's been reported by the West, so of course it must be true, and people, as I understand it, are leaving. So. Yeah.
So the only question mark remains over what's going to happen in Odessa. Do they want that land bridge down to Transnistria?
Yeah.
They've got the land bridge to Crimea already, which was, I think, was going to be one of the objectives in 2014 that didn't happen. But really, Putin would like to have the majority of it wrapped up by Victory Day.
Yes.
In about a week's time, so at least he'd be able to go and say to his people, do you know what, we've gone in, we've done what we wanted to do. These areas are now secure. and there's going to be a bit of scuffling to.
And would you put a timestamp of, say, the 31st of May for this to be done and dusted, and then whatever the body count is, and who knows what it is, there's talk of 15,000, 20,000 Russian dead. I mean, it's a war, right? People die, and that's awful. And you know, whether it's civilians or soldiers, it's awful if anybody, you know, dies as a result of conflict. But would you be saying, because it sounds to me as though, aside from the skirmishing that's inevitable when you've got, you know, it's easy for people to draw lines on maps and call them countries, right?
Yeah.
But from what you're telling me, if I'm hearing you rightly, fundamentally the significant conflict you think is going to be done and dusted now in a matter of weeks.
I think the significant conflict is pretty much done already. But what's prolonged this from the start is the supply of weapons from the West.
Of course.
All Zelensky could have finished it within a few days. He could have said, "Oh, do you know what? Yeah, we're going to be neutral. We're not going to join NATO. We'll recognise those people. We'll implement Minsk," and everybody could have gone home.
The mandate he was elected on.
The mandate he was, the ticket he was elected to do.
Stuart, it's been absolutely fascinating. I've really enjoyed talking to you, getting the alternative view. I don't know about you, but I'm sick and tired of just hearing the Western view, hearing the echo chamber view, and you know, your experiences, as I expected it to be, proved absolutely invaluable in understanding the Russian situation. Just briefly before you go, you mentioned this forum that you own and populate. Do you want to just run that past people that might be interested in partaking of that?
Yeah, we have a discussion forum. You can find it at RU, as in Russia, adventures.com. We've had it probably about 12 or 13 years. It started off as a forum for guys that wanted to date women in Ukraine and Russia. It's morphed through the years into more of a general discussion forum with a former Soviet Union flavour. So you can find everything on there, culture and recipes. You can come and argue to your heart's content about Ukraine or Putin. There's a lot of Americans on there, so there's both sides of the viewpoint there. But there's a fairly good bunch of folks on there, and you can probably get a bit more sensible conversation than you can in some of the corners of Twitter. Sensible
conversation. Blimey.
Silliness too, but mostly sensible.
Stuart, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you ever so much for your time this afternoon. That was Stuart Smith from Manchester, speaking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Thanks, Stuart. Well, that's all for this week. Thank you ever so much to Stuart Smith for joining me as my guest. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Next week, I'm hoping to interview Luke Doherty, who is the chairman of the Orthodox Conservatives. I'm also looking to undertake a wrap-up of the local elections and spend some time looking at the cost of energy crisis and what the government could, and in my opinion should, be doing to mitigate people's ever-increasing bills. Heating or eating? You know the drill. Have a cracking week, everyone. All the best.